The air at the Miller Estate auction tasted of rust and regret. It was a damp October morning in '73, the kind that seeps into your bones and reminds you that another season is dead and gone. Most of the farmers from around the county were there, their faces grim. Losing a farm is like a death in the family, and picking over the bones of a neighbor's life is a grim business. But business it was. I kept to the back, away from the tight knots of gossiping men and the main line of equipment. They were bidding on the good stuff, a nearly new Alice Chalmers 7060, a John Deere planter that still had the shine on its seed boxes. I had no interest in it. My father, God rest his soul, had left me with 80 acres of prime black dirt, a sturdy little farmhouse, and 2 rules: fear God and fear the banker. I ran the farm with what he'd left me, a 1968 John Deere 4020 that was the most reliable thing I'd ever known, and an old Farmall M for the light work. Everything was paid for. Everything was mine. I intended to keep it that way. That's why I was standing in the weeds behind the main barn, looking at a carcass. It had once been a Massey Ferguson 760 combine. In its day, it was a titan, one of the first truly large rotary combines to hit the fields. This one, however, was a ghost. It sat listing to one side, its massive 20-foot grain head buried in the mud like a fallen jaw. The tires were dry-rotted and flat. The sheet metal was a patchwork of faded red paint and deep, cancerous rust. A family of raccoons had made a home in the engine bay, and the cab glass was shattered, leaving the interior open to a decade of Iowa weather. It was scrap. Less than scrap. It was an anchor, a monument to failure. Thinking of getting into the scrap business, Jed? The voice was slick with condescension. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Richard Peterson. Rich had inherited the farm next to mine, just like I had. The difference was, Rich saw his father's operation as a starting line. I saw mine as a fortress to be maintained. I grunted, running a hand over the rusted auger tube. The metal was pitted but thick, solid. Rich strolled up beside me, kicking at one of the flat tires. He was wearing new boots, the kind that hadn't seen a lick of mud. He'd just signed papers at the bank for a brand new International Harvester 1466, complete with a factory cab, air conditioning, and a radio. He'd made sure everyone at the co-op knew it. "Look at this thing," he laughed, a short, sharp bark. Miller bought it thinking he was going to be king of the county. Thing broke down on him second season, and he just left it here to rot. Probably what broke him, trying to keep this beast fed. I didn't answer. I was looking past the rust. I was looking at the bones. The main frame was heavy-duty I-beam, not the pressed C-channel they used on the newer, lighter machines. The final drives, buried in grease and grime, looked massive, overbuilt. I crouched down and peered underneath. The hydrostatic pump was coated in filth, but it didn't show any obvious cracks in the housing. "Auctioneer will probably have to pay someone to haul it away," Rich said, enjoying the sound of his own voice. "You'd be better off with that old pull type you're still running, Jed. At least it runs." He was referring to my old John Deere 45. It was small, slow, and reliable. It also meant I was always the last one done with harvest, working long after Rich had his feet up, listening to the grain prices on the radio in his warm new house. The auctioneer's patter drifted over from the main yard. They were getting to the dregs now, the miscellaneous piles of junk. I stood up and wiped my greasy hands on my jeans. "Maybe," I said, and started walking toward the auctioneer's truck. Rich followed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Don't tell me you're actually going to bid on that heap." When the auctioneer finally got to the Massey, he didn't even bother with a lengthy description. "All right, folks. Lot 247. The Massey Ferguson Combine, as is, where is. Buyer responsible for removal. What am I bid for this piece of agricultural history? Let's get a scrapper's bid. Give me $50. Silence. A few men chuckled. $50 was the price of a good night at the bar. $50, do I hear 50? Come on, boys, the tires are worth that, if you can get 'em patched. I raised a hand. 100. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Rich Peterson let out a loud, theatrical sigh right behind me. Jedediah Stone, folks. Man's got more patience than sense. I got $100 from Mr. Stone, the auctioneer chirped, happy to have a real bid. Do I hear 150? 150? The scrap man, a greasy fellow named Carl, looked it over, squinted, and shook his head. He knew how much work it would be to cut it up and haul it out. He wasn't bidding. Sold! The auctioneer cried, banging his gavel on the truck's fender. For $100 to Jed Stone. Good luck to you, son. The walk to the clerk's table to pay my $100 was a long one. I could feel the eyes on my back. They weren't looks of anger or jealousy. They were looks of pity. They saw a young man clinging to the past, buying another man's failure, falling even further behind in a world that was moving faster every day. Rich clapped me on the shoulder as I passed. You ever get it running, Jed, I'll let you cut my wheat. For a museum fee, of course. I just nodded and paid the lady my money. The receipt felt heavy in my hand. Getting it home was a battle in itself. I had to hire a heavy haul truck, which cost me 3 times what I paid for the machine. We spent half a day just digging the wheels out of the mud and airing them up enough to hold for the trip. The old Perkins V8 diesel was seized up tight, so we couldn't even use the hydrostatic drive to help. We winched it, inch by painful inch, onto the lowboy trailer, the screech of metal on metal echoing across the empty farmyard. By the time we got it back to my place and unloaded it in the shadow of my barn, the sun was setting. The combine looked even bigger and more hopeless on my own property. It was a mountain of rust, a testament to $100 worth of foolish pride. The truck driver shook his head, took my money, and left me there alone with my monster. I stood there for a long time as darkness fell, the chill of the evening air biting at my skin. I could see the lights on in Rich Peterson's new house across the field. He was probably sitting at his dinner table with his wife, laughing about the poor, dumb stone boy who bought the Miller junk pile. Inside my barn, under a single bare bulb, was my workshop. My father had built it. It had a heavy steel beam for a hoist, a solid concrete floor, and every tool a man could need, all paid for. I looked at the combine, this massive, daunting puzzle of broken steel, and then I looked at my hands. They were calloused and stained, but they were capable. My father taught me that a man who can fix his own equipment is a free man. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this resurrection, I have a question for all of you out there who've turned a wrench. What's the biggest piece of junk you ever brought back from the dead? Was it a tractor, a truck, an old engine? Maybe it was something everyone else said was only good for scrap. Drop a comment down below and tell me your story. I read every single one of them. That winter was the coldest in recent memory. The snow came early and stayed late, piling up in deep drifts against the barn doors. For me, it was a blessing. It locked me into my workshop, away from the prying eyes and knowing smirks of my neighbors. The Massey 760 took up nearly the entire main bay, a silent, frozen giant under the weak glow of the incandescent bulbs. The first job was the teardown. It's a baptism by rust and grease. Every bolt is a battle, every connection a potential war. I started with the sheet metal, the big side panels and covers. I spent a week soaking every nut and bolt I could find with penetrating oil, the sharp, chemical smell filling the barn and clinging to my clothes. I learned the unique groan of a bolt that was thinking about breaking, the satisfying crack of one finally giving way after 50 years of marriage to rust. I used a 3/4-inch breaker bar with a 6-foot pipe on the end for leverage, my muscles screaming in the cold air as I put my entire weight into it. The panels came off one by one, revealing the machine's guts. It was a tangled mess of rotten belts, seized pulleys, and chains that were rusted into solid loops. Birds' nests were packed into every crevice. It was worse than I thought. But as I peeled back the layers of decay, I started to see what Old Man Miller had bought into. The engineering was magnificent. The main rotor, the heart of the combine, was a massive, heavy-toothed cylinder suspended on bearings the size of dinner plates. The frame was ridiculously overbuilt. This machine wasn't designed to be replaced in 10 years. It was designed to last a lifetime, if you had the will to maintain it. The biggest challenge was the engine, the Perkins 540, a massive 8.8-litre V8 diesel. It was a legend, known for its tremendous torque, but this one was a boat anchor. The exhaust had been left uncovered, and years of rain and snow had run straight down into the cylinders. It was seized solid. I spent 2 days just clearing the raccoon nests and filth away to get to the engine block. Then, with the chain hoist creaking and groaning under the strain, I lifted the 2,000-pound block of iron out of the combine's frame. It swung there in the middle of my barn, a dead iron heart. I got it on an engine stand and started the slow, meticulous process of disassembly. The heads were the first problem. The bolts were so rusted I snapped 3 of them clean off, which meant hours of careful drilling and using an extractor bit to back them out without damaging the block. When I finally pried the heads off, my own heart sank. The cylinder walls on the right bank were deeply pitted with rust. 2 of the pistons were fused to the cylinder sleeves. Any other man would have hauled it to the scrapyard then and there. Rich Peterson would have laughed and said, "I told you so." But my father's voice was in my head. "Anything made by man can be fixed by man," he used to say. So I got to work. I found a machine shop over in Cedar Rapids that could bore the cylinders and press in new sleeves. It wasn't cheap, but it was cheaper than a new engine. Finding the parts was the real treasure hunt. Massey Ferguson had stopped supporting this model years ago. I spent my evenings on the phone, calling salvage yards from Minnesota to Missouri. I became an expert on the subtle differences between model years. I found a cracked head in a yard in Wisconsin and a set of pistons from a burned-out machine in Nebraska. I drove hundreds of miles in my old Ford pickup, digging through fields of rusting equipment, my hands numb from the cold, to retrieve these pieces of salvation. While the engine block was at the shop, I turned my attention to the rest of the combine. I took apart every moving system. The hydrostatic transmission, the unloading auger, the straw choppers, the cleaning shoe with its complex system of sieves and fans. I laid the parts out on the concrete floor in neat, organized rows. I cleaned every gear, every bearing, every shaft with a wire wheel until it gleamed. Anything that was worn, I either replaced or repaired. I learned to weld, laying careful beads to patch holes in the sheet metal. I learned to use a lathe, turning new bushings out of brass stock. The community didn't understand. They saw my truck parked outside the barn day and night. They saw the lights on at 2 a.m. At the diner, the talk was always the same. Heard Jed Stone is still tinkering with that old Massey. Poor kid. He's going to miss spring planting if he's not careful. Should just cut his losses. Rich Peterson would be there, holding court in his usual booth. "It's a shame," he'd say, shaking his head with false sympathy. His father was a good farmer, but Jed is stuck in the past. You can't make money with junk. You need modern iron to compete. And he was competing. He'd leased another 160 acres, banking on the rising grain prices. The scorn from him was the worst, but the pity from the old-timers was what truly stung. They were my father's friends. They remembered me as a boy, and they looked at me now and saw a fool, squandering his inheritance on a fool's errand. One day in late February, I had a moment of triumph. The rebuilt engine block was back from the machine shop, clean and freshly bored. I had spent a week meticulously reassembling it, checking every tolerance with my plastigauge and torquing every bolt to spec. I had it hanging from the hoist again. After a full day of wrestling it back into the combine's frame, I got it bolted in. I hooked up a temporary fuel line to a 5-gallon can of diesel and connected a pair of fresh batteries. I stood back, my hands trembling slightly. This was the moment of truth. I climbed up to the operator's platform, the cold steel biting through my overalls. I turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the massive engine over slowly, painfully. 1 revolution. 2. It fought against the compression of its 8 huge cylinders. Then, a cough. A puff of white smoke from the open exhaust manifold. I kept the key turned. Another cough, louder this time. And then it happened. With a deafening roar, the Perkins V8 caught. It erupted into life, a thunderous, shaking, angry sound that rattled the windows of the barn. A thick plume of black smoke billowed out, filling the space with the beautiful, acrid smell of burning diesel. The whole machine shuddered on its flat tires. It was alive. I let it run for only 30 seconds before shutting it down, a wide grin splitting my face. My breath plumed in the cold air. It was a small victory, a private one. The combine was still a long way from being field-ready, but its heart was beating again. And in the dead of that long, cold winter, that was enough. The mid-1970s rolled in like a golden tide. For the American farmer, it was a time of unprecedented prosperity. The deal to sell grain to the Soviet Union had sent prices through the roof. Corn that had been $2 a bushel was suddenly $3, then $3.50. Soybeans were climbing even faster. The government was encouraging us to plant fence row to fence row, to feed a hungry world. The money was flowing, and the banks were handing it out like candy. For men like Rich Peterson, it was paradise. He was perfectly positioned to ride the wave. His new, powerful equipment allowed him to farm more land, faster and more efficiently than anyone else. He bought the 80-acre plot on the other side of my farm, the one I'd had my eye on for years. He didn't even haggle. He just paid the asking price, all with the bank's money. The next year, a brand-new Steiger Panther, one of the giant, articulated 4-wheel drive tractors, showed up in his yard. It dwarfed his 1466. It made my 4020 look like a garden tractor. Rich was the talk of the county, the golden boy. He built a new house for his family, a sprawling brick ranch style that sat on a little hill overlooking his fields, and mine. He bought a new Lincoln for his wife and a new Ford F-250 for himself every other year. At the diner, he'd slap the loan officer from the Farmers Trust on the back and buy a round of coffee for everyone. "You gotta be big to win," he'd declare, leaning back in his booth. "Land prices are only going up. Equipment's only going to get more expensive. You gotta borrow now, expand, and lock it in." "Jed here," he'd say, gesturing to me in my corner booth. "He's playing it safe. But you can't save your way to prosperity. Not in this game." And they all nodded. They saw his new iron, his expanding acreage, his confident smile. Then they looked at me. I was still driving the same old truck, still living in the same small house my father built, still running my 40/20. I was making good money, better money than my father had ever dreamed of, but I wasn't spending it. Every check from the grain elevator went into two places. A portion went to the parts suppliers for my ongoing combine project. The rest, the vast majority, went straight into a savings account at the bank. I lived simply. I patched my own clothes, I cooked my own meals. I didn't take vacations. To my neighbors, I looked like a man who was afraid of success. They saw my discipline and called it fear. They saw my patience and called it a lack of ambition. I was becoming the county eccentric, the man who was letting the golden age of agriculture pass him by while he tinkered with a pile of junk. They didn't see what was happening inside my barn. Over 3 years, the Massey Ferguson 760 was reborn. After the engine was running, I started on the systems. I replaced every single belt, all several hundred feet of them. I ordered new bearings for every pulley and shaft, pressing them in myself with my hydraulic press. I taught myself how to rebuild the hydraulic cylinders that lifted the header, carefully replacing the seals and O-rings. The wiring was a nightmare, a rat's nest of brittle, cracked insulation. I tore it all out, every last wire. I bought huge spools of new, heavy-gauge copper wire and a proper set of crimpers. I spent an entire winter painstakingly building a new wiring harness from scratch, following the faded, oil-stained diagrams in a service manual I'd paid $100 for. I added new gauges, new lights, a modern fuse box. I became a master fabricator. The grain tank had rust holes the size of my fist. I cut out the bad metal, welded in new steel, and ground the welds smooth. The unloading auger was bent. I heated it with a torch and straightened it with jacks and chains. The sieves were rusted through. I couldn't find replacements anywhere, so I bought sheets of perforated steel and built new ones myself, copying the design of the old ones. By the harvest of 76, it was ready. It wasn't pretty. The paint was a patchwork of Massey red primer and bare metal. My welds were strong but ugly. It was a Frankenstein's monster of old and new parts, but I knew every single inch of it. I knew the torque spec for every bolt. I knew the sound of the engine when it was happy and the subtle change in vibration that meant a bearing was thinking about complaining. It sat in my shed, fully paid for, a monument not to foolishness, but to independence. That autumn, I took my first harvest with it. Rich Peterson was already half done with his corn, his new John Deere 7700 Turbo, moving through his fields like a giant green insect, leaving a trail of dust and stalks in its wake. I pulled the Massey out of the shed, the big V8 rumbling with a deep-throated confidence. It took me a while to get everything adjusted just right, but when I finally lowered that 20-foot header into my own corn, the machine worked flawlessly. It chewed through the stalks, the big rotor separating the grain with an efficiency that surprised even me. I was doing in one pass what used to take me 3 with my old pull type. I was still the small guy. I was still the subject of jokes. But as I sat in that cab, the cab I had rebuilt with my own hands, watching the clean grain pour into the tank, I felt a sense of satisfaction that no bank loan could ever buy. The end of that year, I was at the Farmers' Trust, making my final deposit from the harvest. The bank was buzzing. The loan officer, a man named Henderson, was glad-handing everyone. The radio on his desk was playing softly, but a news report cut in. A man with a deep voice was talking about the Federal Reserve, about a new chairman named Paul Volcker and his war on inflation. He mentioned something about unprecedented action on interest rates. Rich Peterson was at the next window, signing a stack of papers for another operating loan for the next season. He laughed when he heard the report. "Don't you worry, Henderson," he boomed, clapping the banker on the shoulder. "A little bump in the rates won't hurt. You gotta ride the wave. Prices are just gonna keep going up." Henderson smiled, but it looked a little tight around the edges. "Of course, Rich. You're one of our best customers." I finished my transaction and turned to leave. I saw the number on my deposit slip, the sum total of years of frugal living and hard work. It was a good number, a safe number. I looked at Rich, happily signing his name to yet another debt, and then I thought of my combine, sitting in the shed, quiet and paid for. The newsman on the radio kept talking about inflation and interest rates, and a cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The good times felt brittle, like a thin sheet of ice over deep, dark water. A storm was coming. I didn't know when, but I knew it was out there, just over the horizon, and I intended to be ready for it. The summer of 1980 came in hot and stayed that way. The sky turned a pale, hazy blue, and the sun beat down with a relentless, personal fury. By July, the corn in the fields had that look of quiet desperation. The leaves curled inward during the day, a plant's way of praying for a rain that never came. The ground, our rich black Iowa soil, turned to concrete and then cracked into a mosaic of deep fissures. You could lose a wrench in them. At the co-op, the mood soured with the weather. The old-timers, men who had seen the Dust Bowl, would stare at the brassy sky and shake their heads. "Gonna be a short crop," was the universal, grim diagnosis. For men like Rich Peterson, who had borrowed against the promise of $4 corn and 200 bushel yields, a short crop was a death sentence. I saw the strain on him. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle tension. He was always on the phone, yelling at a seed dealer or a chemical supplier. His new equipment, his fleet of shiny red International Harvester machines, sat idle in the shimmering heat, their massive tires sinking slightly into the soft asphalt of his new driveway. They were thirsty, and he had nothing to give them. When the rains finally came in late August, it was too little, too late. The kernels on the ears were small and shallow. We all knew the yields would be a disaster. Then came the second blow. The news crackled over the AM radio in my workshop. A grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn prices plummeted from over $3 a bushel to $2.20, then $2, with no floor in sight. Harvest that year was a grim affair. It felt less like gathering a bounty and more like salvaging the wreckage. I fired up the old Massey. The Perkins V8 bellowed to life, a familiar and comforting thunder. I eased it into my fields, the 20-foot header seeming ridiculously wide for the stunted, pathetic stalks. But the machine ran. It ran smoothly, dependably, gobbling up what little crop there was. My operating cost was fuel, grease, and my own time. One afternoon, I was finishing a pass near the property line when I saw it. Rich's newest combine, a gleaming red International 1480 axial flow, was sitting dead in the middle of his field, a plume of black smoke staining the sky above it. I shut down the Massey and walked over. Rich was standing beside the machine, his hands on his hips, kicking at a tire. His face, usually tanned and confident, was pale and streaked with grease. "What's the trouble?" I asked. He barely looked at me. Hydrostatic pump, grenaded itself, took out half the lines with it. He gestured at a dark, oily stain spreading across the dry dirt. Thing's not even 3 years old. I nodded. I knew that feeling, but I also knew what came next for him. Calling the dealer. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "They're on their way. $200 just for the service call. The mechanic told me on the phone a new pump is $12,000, 12 grand, and it'll take them a week to get it from the depot in Moline. A week. In the middle of harvest, a week was an eternity. Every day you waited was a day the corn dried down too much, shattering on the stalk, a day the weather could turn and bury what was left under snow. "I've got some hydraulic hose and fittings back at my shop," I offered. "Maybe we could bypass the bad sections to get you going." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a kind of cornered animal desperation I'd never seen before. The golden boy was gone. "It's no good, Jed. The main housing is cracked. It's all computerized, all integrated. You can't just patch this thing like some old junker." He glanced over at my Massey, parked and waiting patiently on the headland, and the insult was clear, even if he didn't mean it to be. I just nodded. "Well, let me know if you need a hand." I walked back to my machine, the quiet hum of its diesel engine, a stark contrast to the dead silence from his. That week, I finished my harvest. Every day, I'd see Rich's combine sitting in the field like a tombstone. The dealer's truck came and went. The field sat untouched. He was bleeding money, bleeding time, bleeding hope. The first cracks in his empire weren't in the soil. They were in the complex, expensive and fragile machinery he had built it on. And the interest on the loan for that machine ticked upwards, day after merciless day, whether the wheels were turning or not. The crisis didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It seeped in like a killing frost. The whispers on the radio about Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve became the headline news. Interest rates, the invisible lifeblood of modern farming, were being weaponized in a war against inflation. The prime rate, the number the banks based everything on, climbed from the single digits into the teens, and then, impossibly, past 20%. For me, it was an abstract number, a piece of bad news on the radio. My loans were all paid, but for the rest of the county, it was a guillotine. The operating loans they had signed at 7 or 8% were variable rate. The friendly letters from the Farmers' Trust Bank were replaced by stark, legal notices. Payments doubled, then tripled. The atmosphere at the diner changed. The easy laughter was gone. Men sat in their booths, staring into their coffee cups, their faces etched with a fear that was deeper than any drought. Foreclosure sale notices started appearing on the bulletin board at the post office, tacked up next to 4-H flyers and church bake sale announcements. The Miller auction had been a sad affair. These were funerals. Farms that had been in families for 100 years were being sold on the courthouse steps. Henderson, the banker who had once clapped Rich Peterson on the back, now looked like a ghost. He'd lost weight, and his eyes darted around nervously, avoiding the gazes of the very men he had encouraged to borrow and expand. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man caught in the gears of a machine far bigger than he was. Rich Peterson was the first of the big operators to fall, and the hardest. His entire empire was a house of cards built on the assumption that prices would always rise and interest would always be cheap. He had leveraged everything. He had borrowed against his land to buy more land, then borrowed against that land to buy bigger equipment. I heard the story in pieces from a neighbor who was related to one of the bank tellers. Rich had missed a payment, then another. Henderson had called him into the bank for a meeting. There was shouting. Rich had stormed out. A week later, the certified letter arrived. The bank was calling his notes, all of them, due in full in 90 days. It was an impossible demand, and everyone knew it. It was just the legal prelude to the end. I saw Rich a few times that spring. He was a changed man. He drove his old beat-up farm truck, the one he'd kept for odd jobs. The new F-250 had been the first thing to go. He looked thin, haunted. The bravado was completely gone, replaced by a hollowed-out silence. We passed on a gravel road one day. I raised a hand to wave, but he just stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and drove on. While my neighbors were drowning, I was treading water. My income was down, just like everyone else's, but my expenses were a fraction of theirs. I didn't have a $1,200 payment for a planter. I didn't have a $3,000 payment for a four-wheel drive tractor. My biggest expense was diesel fuel, and I bought it in bulk when the price dipped. I was making a living, not a killing. In the 1980s farm crisis, that was the same as winning the lottery. My Massey 760 became my symbol of survival. That harvest, a bearing went out on the main rotor. It made a terrible screeching sound, and I shut it down immediately. I didn't have to call a dealer. I didn't have to wait a week for a part. I went to my barn, found the part number in my dog-eared service manual, and cross-referenced it with a standard industrial bearing from the supply house in town. It cost me $42. I had it back together and was running in the field in less than 4 hours. I was my own dealer, my own mechanic, my own master. The freedom in that was worth more than any amount of money Rich Peterson had ever borrowed. The day of the Peterson auction was cold and grey, a November morning that promised an early winter. It felt like the entire county was there. But this time, nobody was looking for a bargain. They were there to witness the end of an era, to see the fall of the man who had represented the very pinnacle of the good times. The auctioneer stood on the flatbed trailer, his voice unnaturally loud in the somber silence. He started with the small things, the tools, the shop equipment, the household goods. Rich's wife, a woman who had always held her head high, stood by the porch of her beautiful brick home, her face a mask of strained composure as neighbors picked over her life, piece by piece. Rich was nowhere to be seen. Then they moved to the big iron. The giant Steiger Panther, its paint barely faded, sold for 60 cents on the dollar to an out-of-state investment group. The International 1480 Combine, the one with the new hydrostatic pump, went for even less. Each sale was a hammer blow, dismantling the kingdom Rich had built on sand. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the land. This was the heart of it all. "All right, folks," he said, his voice softer now, more respectful. "We're now offering the Peterson farm. We'll offer it in 3 parcels. First, the 80 acres, Section 17, bordering the stone property." He was talking about the land I'd watched Rich buy years ago. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands in my pockets, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about revenge. It was about something else. It was about proving my father right. "What am I bid? Let's start it at $1,000 an acre," the auctioneer began. A few bids came in, low and hesitant. The investment group that had bought the tractor made a play for it. The bidding stalled at $1,200 an acre. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, but the money just wasn't there. The fight had gone out of the local farmers. I raised my hand. $1,300, I said, my voice clear and steady. A murmur went through the crowd. Heads turned. The man from the investment group looked at me, sized me up, and then conferred with his partner. He shook his head. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried. "For $1,300 an acre to Jedediah Stone." Next came the Home 80, the parcel with the house, and all the new buildings. The bidding was even more sluggish. No one wanted to buy their neighbor's home out from under them. It felt wrong. The auctioneer struggled to get a starting bid. $500 an acre, I said, breaking the silence. It was a lowball bid, but it got things started. The investment group came back in, seeing a bargain. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing slowly. They were bidding with a calculator. I was bidding with a decade of saved crop checks. When the price hit 1,400, the man from the investment group sighed and shook his head for the final time. It was mine. The house, the barns, the legacy, all of it. After the paperwork was signed, I walked away from the crowd, across the dying lawn, toward the big machine shed. I found Rich inside, sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket, staring at the empty spaces where his tractors used to be. The vast shed amplified the silence. He heard my footsteps and looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and empty. "Come to gloat, Jed?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Come to tell me you told me so?" I shook my head. I walked over and stood before him, the man who had mocked me for years. I saw no enemy. I just saw a farmer who had lost his farm. "I'm sorry, Rich," I said. And I meant it. He scoffed, a humorless sound. "What are you going to do? Bulldoze the house? Put up a monument to the guy who was right all along?" "No," I said. "I was thinking I'd need someone to manage this place. Someone who knows this ground better than anyone. It's too much for me to handle on my own." I hesitated, then pushed on. "The house is yours. You and your family can stay. Rent-free for the first year. Then we'll work something out. I'll pay you a fair salary to be my farm manager. You're a good farmer, Rich. A better farmer than me. You just played the wrong game." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He was looking for the trick, the angle, the punchline. He found none. He slowly deflated, the last of the fight going out of him. He put his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. I stood there awkwardly for a moment, then quietly turned and left him alone in the echoing silence of his empty cathedral. The years that followed were quiet and steady. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving a scarred but wiser landscape. The investment groups that had bought up cheap land found that farming wasn't just a numbers game and sold it off again. The ones who survived, the ones like me, were the ones who were diversified, who were cautious, who feared the banker. My farm grew, but slowly, deliberately. I bought another parcel here, another there, always with cash. Rich became my right-hand man, and in time, a true friend. The weight of ownership lifted from his shoulders. He rediscovered his love for the work itself, for coaxing life from the soil. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence. We made a good team. The community's perception of me shifted. The pity turned to respect. The old-timers at the diner would now ask for my opinion on seed varieties or marketing strategies. "Jed Stone," they'd say to the younger farmers. "He does it the old way, the right way." I married a schoolteacher from town, and we had 2 children, a boy and a girl. We raised them in the same small farmhouse my father had built, though we added on a new kitchen and a second bathroom. One crisp autumn afternoon, when my son Daniel was about 10, I found him in the workshop. The old Massey 760 was in for its annual winter maintenance. It was still our primary combine, a patchwork of welds and primer, but as reliable as the sunrise. Daniel was running his hand over the massive V8 engine block. "Dad," he asked, "why don't we get a new combine, like the ones the neighbors have, with GPS and a television in the cab?" I smiled and wiped my greasy hands on a rag. I walked over and put my arm on his shoulder, the smell of diesel and steel filling the air. "See this machine, son," I said. "This machine taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about having the newest or the biggest. It's about owning what you have. Every bolt on this combine, we own. Every gear, we own. It doesn't belong to the bank. It belongs to us. That means we're free. I picked up a wrench. Your grandfather taught me two things: fear God and fear the banker. And he taught me that anything made by man can be fixed by man. Now grab that socket set. The number 4 injector line looks a little damp. Let's fix it together. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, we worked side by side under the bare bulb of the workshop. The rhythmic clink of our tools was the only sound. I looked at my son's hands, small and clean, next to my own scarred and calloused ones, learning the feel of the steel. I looked out the open door at the fields, stretching out in the fading light. My fields, Rich's old fields, all of it one seamless, debt-free whole. The rust-colored monster in my barn hadn't just been a machine. It had been a teacher. It had been a savior. It was the iron heart of a legacy, built not on the shifting sands of credit, but on the solid bedrock of independence. And it would keep running, season after season, long after the shiny new models had been traded in and forgotten.